All right, folks, before we jump into this interview with Durenda Wilson, we wanted to let you know about a couple of things. One, if you are watching this on video, you're going to notice that nothing really is normal right now because we're like half in the wild, not in our studio anymore, back our old studio. But this episode, we actually recorded from our car. We mentioned in last week's episode that we kind of were under the gun with this recording, and rain came in. We ended up moving everything into our car. And so hopefully the audio sounds about the same as what you're used to. But if you are watching it on video, it's going to look quite a bit different. And for those of you that don't know who Durenda Wilson is, Katie recently read one of her books, really enjoyed it. It's called Raising Boys to Be Men. Durenda Wilson, she's been married for, going on 30 something years. She's been homeschooling for over 30 years. Okay, so I think she's been married for like 34 years. She has 8 children, 6 sons. I think all of her children now, except for one, are out of the house and, graduated from high school. So she's got so much insight and experience to speak from when it comes to homeschooling. She's also authored a couple other books, including The Unhurried Homeschooler, and then the 4-Hour School Day, in addition to The Unhurried Grace for a Mom's Heart. Durenda is a speaker, she's a writer, and she's also a podcast host. And we'll be sure to link down below where you can find her podcast. We actually were able to go on her podcast, and so maybe we'll link that episode below. Maybe you're interested in that episode. Who knows? Hearing us on her podcast. But it was such a treat to be able to have Durenda on our podcast. Even speaking with her offline, it was fun to see how many mutual friends we have, and how I don't know. I always enjoy meeting people like Durenda. It's so encouraging, even though they're in a different part of the country. Her children are raised, and so we know we have a lot to learn from her. And so we're grateful that we get to share her with you all. If you enjoyed this episode, or if you do enjoy this episode or any episode, please take the time to leave a rating or a review. That's what helps us do this podcast. That's what helps us, keep these yellow chairs here planted in the forest to be recording this week's episode.
The Now That We're a Family podcast.
Well, Durenda Wilson, thank you so much for taking time to sit down with us and talk about hopefully a variety of things, raising children, in particular raising boys to men, talking about marriage, homeschooling, all the above. But I'm curious, before we kind of dive into some of these particular, topics, I read that you and your husband had your 8 children within a 13-year span. Yeah, and we're here. We're pregnant with our 6th within 8 years, and so who knows? Yeah, thank you. Who knows? We might be in a similar boat after 13 years. We're on pace, and I'm just curious. Like, as you see it now, looking back retrospectively, was that something that you and your husband were extremely united in from the beginning of marriage, where you're like, hey, let's just get married and have kids? Or was it something where the Lord had been working in both of your hearts at different times? To kind of walk us through that journey with your husband.
Yeah, that was kind of a funny story, actually. My husband announced very loudly from the very beginning that he wanted 2 children, and he wanted them 3 to 5 years apart. And he wanted a boy first and then a girl. And in my head, in my heart, I wanted 10. So I didn't say anything, but I did ask the Lord about it, because I knew every other thing I knew about this man was that I was supposed to marry him. And but that was a little bit of okay, he has a very different idea about kids. What do I do? So I prayed and I asked the Lord for wisdom. And he basically said, you just leave that up to me. I said, okay. And so then we just moved forward. I never told him that I wanted 10 kids until about 4 or 5 years ago. He had no idea.
Wow.
So when it came time after our second one, we had 2 girls first, which was, obviously not what he had planned, which of course made me laugh. When he made that announcement at the beginning, I just laughed. I thought, okay, Lord, this is going to be hilarious. And so we had the 2 girls. And then I said, well, maybe we should try for a boy. What do you think? He said, yeah, let's do that. Let's try for a boy. And in his mind, we can still fit in a regular car and I can manage all of this and yada, yada, yada. And so he agreed to that. And we had a boy. And then when he was about 3 months old, my husband started talking about taking some intervention on his part to make sure we didn't have any more. And I said, well, baby's only 3 months old. Maybe we should give it a little more time. Let's give it at least a year, And then I started praying like crazy, praying and seeking the Lord and reading what few books I could get my hands on about, what does the Bible say about having large families, and, is this something, wise to do or not? And so, but I just kept praying, and I would share something every now and then with him. And I was praying, God, please help me not to nag him about this. This is really a desire of my heart, but I don't want him to be mad at me if things get rough when we've had several kids and look at me and say, this was your idea. So, anyway, all that to say, there was a point at which my husband said, a lot of opinions, lots of good points, he talked to different people. He said, but at the end of the day, what really matters is, what does God say about children? And I said, you're right. He said, so I'm going to go through the scriptures and I'm going to find every verse I can find on children. So he did. And he came back to me. He said, well, there's nothing there. I can't go and take care of this and end our childbearing years, because the scriptures say everywhere that children are a blessing. Like, if there was if God said he was going to bless me financially, I would never say no to that. So why would I say no to the blessing of children? And his mind was just completely changed, and his heart was completely changed. And there was no turning back after that. And we did have a complicating factor that I had all C-sections. So we were having to consider that as well. And, God was so incredibly faithful. When I had my 8th baby, the doctor, he's in there already. He's checking everything out. Is it safe for her to have another one? He looked at me and said, you'd be fine. He said, you look like you might have had 3 C-sections. And I know that's not true for everybody. But I felt like the Lord was blessing our obedience, and 8 was the number he gave us. And that's what we took. And we're so thankful. And even periodically now, he'll look at me and say, thank you for you basically bringing this topic up and talking to me about it and praying about it. And I'm so thankful for all these kids. So, yeah.
Wow. Well, I mean, clearly when you say that, like you felt like the Lord was saying, you need to marry this man regardless. He did have that heart to seek the Lord. And I do think that's like the primary thing that you want when you're looking for a spouse is, are they going to go to God's word if, when push comes to shove, and be like, well, what matters is the Lord over any other opinion.
Exactly. And I knew already up to that point, there'd been several things that had come to my mind that I wanted to talk to him about, but I felt like I needed to wait for him to take the initiative. And every time I prayed, Lord, I'd really like to talk about this particular topic, the next time I saw him, he would bring up that topic. And that's when I knew, like, okay, if I can pray and this man can hear, this is all we need. We can get through anything.
Wow.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that story. I think that's really encouraging for me to hear, honestly, just hearing how the word of God is what actually changed his heart. And we know that as Christians, that's what does the work. It tells us that it truly penetrates our heart. And I think that's so encouraging, because we hear quite often from listeners, from husbands or from wives saying, I want more, but my spouse says they're done. That's a common occurrence. And it's so cool how you really trusted the Lord, and you really let the Lord do the working in his heart, the word of the Lord do the working in his heart. And as Katie said, if you're looking for looking for a spouse, God's word has to be the final authority. Otherwise, it's just going to be, this is going to be wishy-washy, and you're going to be all over the place in convictions. But that's a really encouraging story. So thank you for sharing that. Now, after having children, because I want to hear more about your story, if you don't mind. Homeschooling is a whole other thing. And really, some of your most popular resources really kind of center around that. Is it the unhurried homeschooling? Is that it?
Yes.
And so was homeschooling one of those things that you and your husband were united on from the get-go, or was that something that took some working in both of your heart as well? Would you mind sharing how that came to be?
That particular topic, we were definitely in agreement on. So his brother happened to already be homeschooling his kids, and this was in 1989. So he had that example that had sort of blazed the trail. And so I knew I wanted to homeschool my kids before I ever met my husband. So when I brought the topic up, he was fully on board. Had no. Now, when it came to actually homeschooling the kids, my idea of taking an unhurried approach had him a little bit questionable. But he prayed about it, and he just felt like he needed to just let me move forward with what I felt like the Lord was laying on my heart. And now we go to conferences and speak, and he is like the biggest fan of unhurried homeschooling, and he talks to people about it all the time. So, I love the way the Lord works that out, just that trusting the Lord first and committing everything we do to him. I think about that passage in Psalm 37. It says, commit yourself to the Lord. Basically trust in him, and he will give you the desires of your heart. And if the desires of your heart aren't good, he'll change those, as long as we're continuing to go back to him and yield ourselves fully to him. And I think this is something that a lot of believers forget or just don't realize the importance of. Every area of our lives needs to be yielded to the Lord. And this is why people don't question birth control. Christians don't question it. Christians don't question, deciding this is how many kids we want. That's it. They maybe don't even consult the Lord on it, So I'm always encouraging parents, look, I don't think every family should have a ton of kids. I love to see wonderful, godly homeschooling families having as many as possible, because I think that's really impacts the culture and it impacts the next generation hugely. But my real hope and prayer for people, for believers, is that they will at least take it to the Lord and say, God, what do you want? And truly listen for the answer. And then whatever that is, if that's one, great. If it's two, fine. Whatever God wants, that's what we want. We want what God wants. And I think that's the important thing.
Wow. And I just have a couple follow-up questions, but one of them is, why did you decide you wanted to homeschool way back then? Like, was there someone you met or knew or what,
I had never heard of homeschooling until I met a family who had 4 kids and were homeschooling. And this was like 1986. And I loved these kids. They were hilarious. They had the best sense of humor, and they were so quick and so incredibly well-adjusted socially and all of that. They had confidence, but they weren't obnoxious. They were just really funny and fun to be around, and just witty and all these things. And I was like, wow, this is really impressive. And then I picked up a book, and I don't know if it was before or after. It was probably after. I think it was at a yard sale or something. And I think I was still a teenager at the time, maybe my early 20s. I picked up a book by Raymond and Dorothy Moore called Better Late Than Early. And as I read through that book, I couldn't believe how so many things this man said resonated with my own heart for my children that I already had for these kids I didn't even have yet. I could just, everything, so much of what he was saying was just, yes, that's what I want. Yes, this makes so much sense. I knew enough about child development to know that his reasoning and logic and the things he was saying made sense developmentally for the different ages that he was talking about. Because I had taken some child development classes. I'd worked with kids since I was like 10 years old. So lots of observation, and I love kids. And so, all of that sort of absorbed. And then when I read what he had to say, it was sort of like the clincher for me, and also what encouraged me to take an unhurried approach to homeschooling.
We love live music in our home. I think you would love live music in your home if you don't already enjoy it in your home. And that's why we made Voperg Music Academy. Check out the coupon below, and you get a special discount for being a listener of this podcast, and you can bring live music into your home. Piano, guitar, fiddle, mandolin, ukulele. If any of those instruments sound like fun to you to learn or to have your children learn, go check it out.
Okay, because that was something else I was curious about, was when you say unhurried, what that specifically means. Because there's so many terms out there with, maybe an unschooling education, or, like things the different people can pin to unschooling. I do have to read that book because your mom, that's the book that she read, Better Late Than Early.
Yeah, that was kind of the impetus in my mom pursuing homeschooling, all those years ago.
You guys are probably around the same, age.
Yeah, the same time frame.
Same stage when you would have read that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But so what did unhurrying homeschooling look like in your home, and what do you encourage other parents to do when you say have an unhurried homeschool?
Well, I think that the first thing is that just because a child turns 5 does not mean it's time to read. I think it's so important for parents to understand that there's not this, you don't flip a switch at 5 years old, and all of a sudden your child launches into all of this curriculum and book work and all of that. They're not ready for that. They don't flip just because they turn 5, And so there's this idea, because of the traditional school system, that tells us, okay, now it's time. Now we give up all the fun stuff and we make our kids start doing all the hard stuff they don't want to do. And this is absolutely developmentally inappropriate for kids. And so what we did was we took a very slow approach in when it came to book work. We were still doing lots of things together. We were baking, they had little chores and responsibilities they had to do. We had a simple routine. We went to the library. We did, we just tried to engage our kids in just daily life. And they played outside a lot. They built blanket forts and all kinds of things. They did the fun that kids want to do at this age. And shocker, they're actually learning while they're doing all of these things. And so that was what I really wanted for our kids. And then when I felt like they were ready to learn to read, or they were ready to learn to start doing basic math or writing, then we would start into that, and it would be fun, and it would be easy, and it would be low key, because I didn't want to just squelch their love for learning by just forcing too much down their throats too early, because we know that forced learning isn't real learning. So kids learn best when they're really interested and engaged in things. And so that's what I tried to keep encouraging from an early age, and then all the way through even to high school. But of course, we slowly put more and more responsibility on them academically as they were ready over the years. And I didn't know if it was going to work or not. It was just one of those things I felt like the Lord was laying on my heart, something I wanted them to have a childhood. I wanted them to do things that kids should be able to do, ride their bikes and play outside and get out all their energy and play in the dirt and all that stuff. And they got to do that. And to this day, they thank me for giving them that time every day to be able to do that. And so we just set up our family rhythms in a way that was conducive to that. The other part of unhurried that I really want to emphasize is that we as moms need to unhurry our hearts, and we need to walk away from fear about our homeschooling, and we need to bring it to the Lord, and we need to say, God, what do you have for our family? So taking the time to listen for his direction. And that means you got to quiet all the other things that are going on in your head, and you have to get quiet and slow down and be with the Lord to find out what it is he has for you. And one of the questions I asked myself early on that really helped me with that was, I just said, okay, Durenda, if there was no fear involved in deciding how you were going to homeschool, and there was no one telling you how to do it, what would you want to do with your kids? And I immediately knew the first few things for sure. And that helped get me started down the road of, I think this is what God has for our family. And so I would encourage moms to do that.
Interrupting today's episode, we have to talk to you about our one and only sponsor, because we are very picky about who sponsors the show, and that's Good Ranchers. So goodranchers.com is who delivers all our meat out here in the forest. They did it in the suburb. They're doing it again while we're cooking our meat here on the Blackstone. We had their meat for 4th of July and loved it. Lots of steaks, their garlic chicken, fajitas with their pre-cut chicken. That's one of my favorite things that they offer is their pre-cut chicken, because I don't like touching chicken. It's gross. Their chicken is pasture raised, so we don't have to worry about it being gross, but chicken's still kind of slimy. Anyways, today, you guys, if you claim your free box from goodranchers.com, or not your free box, if you claim a box at goodranchers.com with our code VOTEBERG, then you will get $100 off that box and free American Wagyu burgers for a year.
Wow.
Which is a pretty awesome offer. It's the biggest sale Good Ranchers has ever done. And let me see here. Okay, other cool things is Good Ranchers is also supporting the Paralyzed Veterans of America too, which is awesome, to support American farms and American veterans. I love how they keep all of the focus here on our local country. For all of our international listeners, you guys are great, but I'm proud to be an American.
Same.
So it's very encouraging to be supporting American farms that are also growing in a way that is beyond organic and not destroying our country with all this gross stuff, our bodies, and the way that farming is happening. So anyways, super grateful for the way that Good Ranchers chooses their farmers, and we highly encourage you guys to buy their meat because we love it every single meal that we eat it. So again, you could head to goodranchers.com. You could use our discount code VOTEBERG and claim $100 off plus free Wagyu burgers for a year when you subscribe, which is $400 value. So give it a shot and enjoy Good Ranchers, American meat delivered.
Yeah, that's really, I love how you've really made it clear that, unhurried homeschooling is not the same as unintentional homeschooling. Just the fact that you actually asked yourself that question, what would I even want to do? Is obviously you're being intentional, you're being proactive, rather than, and maybe, I'm curious, were these some of you said your husband, it took him a little while to get on board with maybe the philosophy or the method. And do you think that was kind of maybe him looking at some of the more arbitrary benchmarks that are in place by society and saying, boy, are the kids hitting them or are they not? And if so, or honestly, just what were his hangups, and how could you kind of speak to spouses getting on the same page with that, having those conversations, because obviously you want there to be unity in the marriage and how your children are being educated. So what was that like?
Well, our days consisted of, we had, like some chores, breakfast, a few more chores, did inspections, because I say you can't expect what you're not willing to inspect. And then we would move into whatever book work, if we were doing book work at this point in the game. And then it was kind of like, so there was this directed learning time in the morning, but all the way through 8th grade, they were done by noon. That was our goal, to be done by noon. And the high schoolers sometimes went past. And that's kind of how I framed up the 4-hour school day. I talk about that in there. And then in the afternoon, they had directed time, or self-directed time, from 2 to 4 in the afternoon, after they had rest. So lunch, rest, and then they had this 2 to 4 time. And so my husband, his hang up at the very beginning was just, and he will say this to this day, all he had in his brain was this picture of the traditional classroom. If we aren't doing it like that, then the kids might not learn what they're supposed to learn. But like I said, he just sort of like prayed about it and let it go. And he saw our kids thriving. He saw them happy. He saw them learning. He saw them, and it wasn't maybe the conventional way to learn where we were in the books all day. It wasn't. But he could see that there was peace in our household, that what we were doing was giving life to me. It was life-giving to our kids. And so once he saw that, he said, he basically, I think, came to the conclusion that he could trust for the rest of the journey, that the Lord was doing what he wanted to do in our family. And we talked a lot. I would explain things to him and why I was doing what I was doing, why I was doing it this way, if he had questions or whatever. But for the most part, he was really good about trusting me, and trusting my heart for our kids.
A question I have for you is, in Raising Boys to Men, I loved that book. It was so good. And you speak specifically to homeschooling boys, and that was really encouraging to me, because I feel like once a quarter, at least twice a year, I look up like our local classical Christian school, for one of my boys. It's like, maybe this would be a good option. And we always end up working through it once I picture how long they would have to be gone every day from me. Yes. But how your book was really encouraging in that, how you're an authority to your sons, but they're also growing into these men, and you are a woman. And so how can you speak to like how you navigated that, especially as you're going through, puberty and high school and beyond?
Yeah, I think the part talk about respect in the book is really an important thing, because the respect goes both ways. The respect has to be towards me as their mom, but also me as mom toward them, respecting their boyhood, their manhood, and understanding that they're wired a certain way, that God wired them this way. And how can I best work with how they're wired, not to make them, I'm not out to make them like a girl. I don't want them to be a girl. I want them to be a man. And so that means that there are some things I'm going to have to let them do that scare me. I need to say yes to as many things of their crazy ideas as possible, while still protecting them. And those ideas are often outside of my comfort zone. And so that required me to say, Lord, do I let them do this or not? And I would just kind of have this sense of peace, or maybe I would have a caveat to go with it. You can do this, but someone has to come back and tell me you're still alive or whatever. And so as they went into, I think the boundary setting is really important in the early years. That really develops the respect for mom, and then mom allowing the boys to have copious amounts of playtime, making sure that they have important missions to be on. And that's just what a lot of what I explain in the book is how they're wired, how they're put together, and how to work with that. And then as they go into the teen years, it's super important that you maintain that respect as a mom. And so one of the examples I like to give is at one point, one of my boys referred to me as bruh. And I immediately said to him, I am not your bruh. I'm your mom. And my husband was really good at backing me up on you need to respect your mom and all of that. And then I also needed to respect where they were hormonally. So what that meant was I feel like they lose a piece of their brain when they get into the teen years. And so they start to forget things that they would normally remember. And it's really frustrating as a mom because you may have had the super responsible kid and now all of a sudden it appears that he's not responsible. But what's really happening is his brain and his body are changing a ton. And this is what I had to explain to the boys. I said, you know what, you are changing from a boy to a man. There's a whole lot going on in your body. And so part of that is your brain is just sometimes gonna kick into neutral and you're gonna forget to do things. And so I will work with you and show as much grace as I can. I'm still going to hold your feet to the fire to be responsible, but I will try to have some grace for where you are. And the other part that I really needed to have grace in was recognizing that I needed to use less words with them. And this was something that was a huge eye opener for me. I kind of knew that guys tend to do better with less words, but I really learned this the hard way when they were teenagers, when I had 4 teenage boys and they were just frustrating me. And I told my husband about it. And he basically said, they don't respect you when you use too many words and you're using too many words. And so I went back to them and said, is this what's happening? And they said, yes, Mom, we would rather experience physical pain than listen to you talk so much. And they weren't being disrespectful. They were being honest. You could feel the authenticity and the respect that. And I said, okay, I'm going to work with you on this. But here's the deal. I'm going to work hard to tell you what I need to tell you in 15 seconds or less. But if you don't do it, then there's going to be some pretty harsh consequences. And they agreed. And I can't remember that we ever had any harsh consequences because it worked so well for them. And I actually had somebody say, this is a terrible idea. You're teaching them that they only have to listen, if you say it a certain way. And I said, well, wait a minute. They were teenagers at the time. So I was actually showing them grace for the time in their life where they needed me to show that grace. They eventually grew into men who developmentally got to that point where they can handle more words. Three out of the 5 so far are married, and they are married to women who love to talk, and they're doing just fine. So there you go.
Well, thank you for sharing all of that. It's I feel like there are so many things I wish I could parachute in on and ask about, because we have 4 boys. We have 4 boys now, and they're all going to be teenagers at the same time. And I know that that's a thing that Katie, like she already mentioned, she considers a lot, because we have every intention to homeschool all the way through our children, but that's a lot of time for teenage boys to be with their mom, right? And so I think it is cool. Katie also, was talking about how you've done such a good job of, I don't know if deferring is the right word, but really leaning on the authority of your husband, maybe. Yes. And so how did you kind of exercise that? Because I think of the stereotype that my mom certainly implemented, was like, well, just wait until your father gets home, right? Like that's always a good fallback. But was there any more of a nuanced way that you kind of implemented that type of, leaning on your husband's authority?
Yeah. When I felt stuck, when I didn't know what to do, it wasn't clear what I was supposed to do with the boys on a certain thing, whether it was discipline wise or homeschooling, I would pray and I would ask the Lord to give my husband wisdom, because I think as homeschooling moms, a lot of times we assume, or even as moms, we assume, oh, well, he isn't home with us all day, so he doesn't understand. He's not going to be able to give us a good gauge on what to do. But that's not true, because God has put him in the position he's in. And I believe that God empowers him to do that, whether he's with you all day or not. And I trusted that. And after learning the hard way, I will say that. And I would go to him and I'd say, Lord, I'm going to ask him these questions. Would you please just use him to speak to me, and so that I know what to do? And I would go to my husband and I would ask him the question, and pretty much unfailingly, he would have a great plan, a great idea, and that I'd never thought of, because he knew how boys think. He knew where they were coming from. He could explain even why they had the responses they did and how to get a more effective result from them in whatever we were dealing with.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I'm curious, another follow-up in regards to just parenting in general, boys, girls. Here we are in 2024, and now your children are all adults, grown adults. Looking at like what culture, society, technology was like even just 20 years ago versus now, I think it's easy as parents to say, well, everything's changed, and so whatever worked 20 or 30 years ago is not going to work now. And I don't think that's always, obviously the tactics need to change and there's different challenges, but can you point to any just kind of age old principles where you're kind of like, and then even if you're willing to even use examples, I don't know if you guys had movies, video games, and then eventually social media, smartphones, all those things, if that was the type of thing that you really navigated on a case by case situation with your children, or if they were just like house rules, house principles, and what that looked like in your home.
Well, when we first started parenting, of course, there was no internet, there was nothing. And so I had the privilege of learning what it was like to parent without it. So, and to have family time without that problematic variable in the equation. Of course, we had TV and that kind of thing, but we never had cable. We were very careful about what our kids watched, and it was very limited time. So that's how we started. And then eventually, when our kids were getting into the teen years, that's when the phone started coming out and all of that. And our rule was, first of all, you can't have a phone unless you can pay for it. And none of them were gainfully employed. So that was not going to be a problem for a long, long time. So that was one way we put it off. The video game thing was something our boys especially, were really interested in. And I just said, no, for the longest time. And finally, my husband pulled the trigger and said, I think it's time. And so we bought them a gaming system, and they were so shocked because they were pretty sure they were probably never going to get one. And then the hard work started of, how do we navigate this? There were no books. There was nothing out there to help you through it. And so I had to pray a lot. And I still would highly recommend that for any parent. God would wake me up sometimes at night saying, you need to check this kid's history, or you need to, whatever on the internet. We really tried to stay off the internet as well with the kids. That's a whole other thing. And I just actually did a couple of podcast episodes on time with kids and screen time with teens, and really interesting information from a gal that I was interviewing. But basically, I gave the boys 30 minutes a day to game. And if I saw or even got a hint that it was becoming an idol for them, we took Sabbath. They took a Sabbath automatically, one day, 2 days. And if I said, no, you need to take a break from it, and they got mad, then they just doubled the time. We really tried to be really firm about that. There's this part that it's hard because, like, one of our sons is a software engineer for Amazon. So computers and that kind of thing was really his thing, but we still limited it. And what we did was, we had so much life we were living that we didn't have much time left for any kind of screen. And I think that parents have to be very, very, very vigilant and give their kids a life first, a strong family life. Don't let anything stop you from that. Don't let anything distract you from that. Doing real life and having real life relationships and real life experiences pretty much 99% of the time. And I will tell parents to this day, go without screens as long as you possibly can, because I think that is in the best interest of the children, especially in those early, as they're developing so much in those elementary years and all of that. So that's kind of what our experience was like.
And I'm curious, having 8 kids, because this is just something that, like, I consider, even though they were close within 13 years, you still had a spread there. And so what was kind of the most difficult part, like best and difficult part, I would say, of having that spread of, a teen child while having an infant? How'd you navigate that?
It was tricky because, the teenagers, they like to stay up at night and talk, and then the babies like to get up early. And so that's always, sleep is a problem. So that's something we have to navigate as moms. We need to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves. Sleep wise, I think that's super important. But I think that the biggest stretch is just that mental stretch of, okay, now I'm talking to a teenager, now I'm talking to a 2-year-old, and just not getting them confused, looking at your 2-year-old and saying, why are you acting like a 2-year-old? Oh, wait, you're 2, and so I think that's the challenge. And um, keeping up with all the different developmental stages. I think it's just having the time to sit back. I think the most helpful thing my husband and I did was we had a once a week union. So we would go through every kid. We would talk about any concerns, anything we saw that we thought might need to be worked on, anything we thought that was going well. And we did that weekly, and that helped us really keep a pulse on together on what was happening with our kids so we could stay on the same page. And I was a huge fan of having margin in my day so that when my kids came into the house or they were walking through the room, I would say, hey, what are you doing? What's up? How are you doing? Checking in with them. I knew where my kids were pretty much all the time, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, but that took time out of my day to inquire regularly as to how they were doing and all of that. The flip side is the older kids, and I really worked hard not to overwork them. I didn't want them to feel like they'd already done parenting by the time they became parents, and especially since we had 2 girls first. But the help was really tremendous. It was really helpful, and it was very I think it was very bonding for everybody. And I think everything worked out fine because our 2 girls they want large families. They love being moms. And so, but I think just that having that kind of support and that help and being able to tell them how much you appreciate them and how much you appreciate their help. And they just feel like something that they're part of something bigger than themselves. And I think that's super important, especially when they're going into the teen years, when they tend to get real internal. You want to keep them other oriented to a certain degree. And so I think actually having a lot of kids can help with that.
Wow, that's so
encouraging.
it's really encouraging to hear because, like you said, I think it is easy if your oldest, couple or oldest is a daughter, and they tend to be helpful, when it comes to chores or parenting. That you said, what'd you say? You like overparent them before they're even parents, or no? You have them parent before they're parents,
Exactly.
And we've seen that certainly happen with some peers of ours, and it is unfortunate when then they get to marriage age or whatever, and they don't want to have anything to do with their kids, or they don't want to have kids. Right. And so it's a cool testimony that your daughters desire that, that they have that sentiment towards family. That's an awesome testimony. Go ahead.
Oh, and like you said, that it was bonding. The help and the work that they did do made them feel that sense of responsibility and confidence. It's such a line to walk, and I do think it is. Yeah.
And I think that that a lot of moms tend to feel guilt for having the older kids help. And I do think you're right. It's a fine line. We do have to walk it carefully. But at the same time, it's a real privilege and it's an opportunity for our kids. One thing I love is that all my kids went into parenting with eyes wide open. They knew what it meant to be a parent. They knew how to be a parent. And sometimes some of them married spouses that had no clue. And so they leaned really hard into our kids, and they sort of taught them how to parent, and it's really been cool to see, So and fortunately, their spouses have been willing students and wanting to be the best parents they can be, and so it's been actually really bonding for them as a couple. So.
Yeah, and that is pretty powerful that you're now in this season of seeing really the fruit of your labor, in your grandchildren, seeing your children bring up your grandchildren, the nurture and admonition of the Lord. And it seems like you're still very much, I don't know, in the game, for lack of a better term. I mean, just prior to recording, you were just on the phone, with, a son and a daughter-in-law talking about some stuff with a grandchild. And I was like, man, you're still in the mix. Was that something that you had foreseen being the case when you were parenting, thinking, did you have this like, man, the finish line is when they're 18 and out of the house, or did you have a longer term vision for being involved in your children and grandchildren's life? Because it seems like that's certainly how you're now living.
I felt like the way we were raising our kids, we were also raising our grandkids and our great grandkids. So I think we as a culture have forgotten, and we don't have a multi-generational view, and that's actually a biblical view. if you go to the scriptures, you start looking, you'll see it everywhere. And I think that's important because our culture has informed us about family, and the way it's informing us is wrong and it's selfish. And I knew that, like, I wanted to have that. I did have that thinking as I was investing in my kids, but I didn't know what it would look like past 18. I had no idea. My husband and I, our parents were not involved with our kids at all. So my husband and I had to lean really hard into each other. And so we were kind of it made us a pretty strong family unit, strong marriage. I think that was actually good. That's what God had for us. But I wanted my kids to have that support, but I didn't know what that looked like. And I'm still walking that journey after 11 years. Our oldest has been married 11 years, and still, but the Lord's really been giving me some really awesome clarity lately. And I've tried to be really careful about not overstepping, but I'm finding that I've actually been almost too careful, and that the Lord does want me to use my giftings to speak into our kids' lives at certain points. And it helps also that we have several of our kids living on the property with us. And so we literally have 6 grandkids running around all the time. So it's great because I don't lose touch with what's going on with what goes on with little kids.
Well, it's so cool to hear too that you and your husband are even aware of the value that there was in you two needing to lean into each other early on in marriage, and not necessarily, ripping your kids off from that opportunity as well, but wanting to be a support. And so I think that's, it's easy
That's
to do.
another line.
Yeah, it's like you said, another line, right? And you want to go one or the other. And so it's really cool to hear your continued intentionality in that, and not just saying, well, hey, we're going to be the full support to our children and the grandchildren to the extent that they don't have to then lean into each other and form that same bond. Yeah, so that's really cool that you guys are experiencing that and continuing to consider, how that best looks for you now in this stage of life.
Yeah. So could you tell us, we want to respect your time here, but would you be able to tell us where people can find your resources? And I know you're currently podcasting, you're writing, you're doing a ton aside from being a grandma and mother and wife. So can you tell our listeners where they can find more resources from you?
Yes. The Durenda Wilson Podcast is a great way to connect with me. I do 2 episodes a week. And on the podcast page of my website, at the top of the list of episodes, there's actually a search bar, because there's over 500 episodes. You can put in a keyword and those episodes will come up that you actually need to listen to. Because if you're doing kindergarten, you don't want to hear about high schooler, and you don't want to scroll through 500 episodes. So I would encourage you to check that out. And then my website, durendawilson.com. And then I have 4 books: The Unhurried Homeschooler, The 4-Hour School Day, Unhurried, Grace for a Mom's Heart, and Raising Boys to Men. And all 4 of those books can be found on Amazon.
Wow.
Yeah, and I've been so encouraged just by Raising Boys to Men. I'm looking forward to reading your other books because, again, it just really spoke to my heart. And you could just tell that you're so seeped in God's word and in his perspective on things. And that's what our culture needs today. They need women like you who have the fruit and are now speaking from that fruit too. It's not all theory. Like, you have adult kids who can stand by and be like, yes, I agree. And that just means so much to me.
Yes. And it's cool that you have that feature on your website where you can search the keyword.
Yeah,
That's honestly
jealous.
a really great tool. So I'm excited for our listeners to be able to utilize that. Well, Durenda, thank you so much for taking the time. Really grateful that you have been gracious enough to share with us and with our audience. And please keep up the good work. I know we're grateful for it.
Thank you for having me. It was a great conversation.